I was standing in my own husband's office, staring at a drawer I had never once tried to open in 20 years of marriage, when I noticed the lock hadn't caught. Just a quarter inch, just enough. I didn't know yet that what was behind that quarter inch of space would end my marriage. I only knew that my hand was already reaching for it, before my mind had decided anything at all. My name is Margaret Coleman. Everyone calls me Maggie, except my husband Richard, who has called me Margaret since the day we met, because he said Maggie sounded like a name for someone who hadn't grown up yet, and he liked that I had. That should have told me something about him right there, 20 years ago, but I was 20 years younger too, and I mistook seriousness for depth. Richard and I met at a church social in the fall, introduced by mutual friends who thought a steady young accountant and a school teacher made a sensible match. And it was sensible. That's the word I would have used for most of our marriage if you'd asked me. Sensible. Stable. Richard built a small financial advisory practice in our town, the kind where he knew half his clients from high school and the other half from church, and people trusted him the way you trust a man who never raises his voice and never misses a mortgage payment. We raised 2 children in a modest colonial 3 streets from the elementary school. We paid off that house. We paid off the next one. Richard managed every dollar that came through our lives with the same quiet, careful precision he brought to his clients' portfolios, and I never once had reason to ask him to explain himself, because explaining himself was, in a sense, his entire profession. The desk in his office had belonged to his father, a heavy oak thing with brass fittings that Richard restored himself the year after we got married, sanding it down in the garage for an entire summer with a devotion I found almost tender at the time. When we moved into this house 15 years ago, the desk came with us, and so did the small brass padlock on its bottom drawer, a detail I noticed on our first week here and asked about exactly once. "Old tax files," Richard said. "Nothing interesting. Some client documents from years back I'm supposed to keep sealed." I believed him because there was no reason not to. Marriages are built on 1,000 small acts of not asking, and I had never thought of that as a weakness until the night I stood in his office and saw the lock hanging loose. Our children are grown now, Elizabeth in Denver with her own family, and our son Thomas finishing his residency 2 states away. And the house has settled into that particular quiet that comes after decades of noise. I'd started cleaning the office that evening, simply because I finally had time to, dusting shelves I hadn't touched in months, and it was only when I reached the bottom drawer of that old desk that I noticed the small padlock wasn't seated properly in its clasp. I told myself I was only going to fix it, push it back into place, that was all. My fingers had barely touched the drawer's handle when Richard's voice came from the doorway, and something in it made me go still before I even turned around. "Margaret?" I looked up. He was standing there in his work clothes, still holding his briefcase, and his face had gone the particular gray color I'd only seen on him twice before in 20 years. Once when his father died, and once when Thomas was in the hospital with appendicitis at age 9. "The lock wasn't catching," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Too careful, too calm. "I was just going to fix it." "Don't open it." He set the briefcase down slowly, the way you'd set something down if you were afraid the sound of it hitting the floor might break whatever fragile thing was happening in the room. "Richard, it's just tax files. You said so yourself. Please, Margaret." He crossed the room and gently, so gently it frightened me more than force would have, closed the drawer and refastened the lock with hands that were, I noticed, not entirely steady. Some things are better left buried. I want to tell you I asked him right then what he meant. I want to tell you I demanded an answer the way some braver version of myself might have. Instead, I did what 20 years of marriage had trained me to do. I let it go. I told him, of course. I understood. Everyone has things they'd rather not revisit. And I went downstairs and made dinner, and we ate at our kitchen table the way we had 10,000 times before, discussing the Hendersons' new fence and whether Elizabeth's flight home for Thanksgiving would connect through Denver or Chicago. But that night, lying beside a man I had shared a bed with for 2 decades, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, replaying the exact shade of gray his face had turned, and the particular way he'd said please, a word I had almost never heard him use, not once in 20 years, not even when he was asking for something. Richard didn't plead. Richard explained, calmly, reasonably, the way he explained everything, because reason was the only language he'd ever needed to get what he wanted. He had pleaded with me tonight. And some old, quiet part of me, the part that had noticed small things for 20 years and simply chosen not to look at them too closely, finally sat up in the dark and said, "Something is wrong in that drawer, and you already know it." I spent the next several days doing what I imagine most women in my position do. I told myself stories. Maybe it was something to do with his father's death, something Richard had never fully processed and kept sealed away rather than face. Maybe it was old client files containing sensitive financial information he was legally obligated to protect, and his reaction had simply been a man protecting his professional integrity. Maybe, I told myself while folding laundry, while grading the stack of essays I still take on part-time from the community college, while watering the ferns on the back porch, it was nothing at all. 20 good years don't unravel over a locked drawer. But the stories I told myself kept bumping up against small things I'd spent 2 decades choosing not to examine too closely. There was the safe deposit box at the bank downtown, opened years ago for important documents, to which I had never been given a key, only ever assured it contained boring legal paperwork, nothing you need to worry about. There was the post office box that Richard rented under the business name, which received mail every Thursday that he always collected himself on his way home from the office. A small errand he'd performed without fail for as long as I could remember, one I had simply absorbed into the rhythm of our life, the way you absorb the sound of a furnace kicking on. There were the weekend conferences, 2 or 3 times a year, always in the state capital, always described in the vaguest professional terms, continuing education credits, industry seminars, details I had never once asked him to specify because why would I? He was an accountant. Accountants go to conferences. I called my oldest friend, Diane Foster, on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands. Diane and I met in college, before Richard, before any of it, and she has spent the better part of 40 years being the one person in my life who says the things everyone else is too polite to say. She'd never disliked Richard exactly. She'd simply never fully trusted the quiet, careful way he moved through the world, the way he answered every question with exactly the amount of information required, and not one word more. 20 years, Diane said, after I told her about the drawer. And you've never once asked what's actually in that desk? It's tax files, Diane. He's told me that for 15 years. Maggie. She said my name the way she always does, when she's about to say something I don't want to hear. My cousin Patricia was married 31 years. 31. And she found out 4 months ago that her husband had a second family 2 towns over. A whole other life, Maggie. A woman, 2 kids, a mortgage he'd been quietly paying for over a decade. And you know what Patricia told me? She said, looking back, there were always small things. A locked file cabinet, weekend trips that didn't quite add up, a man who managed the money so completely that she never once saw the whole picture. It's always the quiet ones who need something locked away, honey. The loud ones, you can see coming from a mile off. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, staring out my kitchen window at the garden Richard and I had planted together our first spring in this house, and I felt something shift inside me, quiet but immovable, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. I decided, sitting at that table, that I needed to know what was in that drawer, not because I believed the worst. I want to be honest with you. Even then, I told myself I was probably about to feel foolish for doubting a good man over old tax documents. But 20 years of marriage had taught me that the only true way to have peace of mind was to have actual knowledge, not borrowed reassurance. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I decided I would find out something on my own terms, quietly, without asking Richard's permission first. I didn't tell him what I'd decided. I simply began, very carefully, to pay attention. I want to explain something about the version of myself that emerged over the following 2 weeks, because it surprised even me. I have never in my life been a deceptive person. I have never gone through anyone's mail, never checked a phone, never once in 20 years searched Richard's pockets or questioned his whereabouts. And yet, within days of that conversation with Diane, I found myself becoming something quieter and more watchful than I had ever been, a woman noticing everything and revealing nothing, and there was a strange, uncomfortable thrill in it that I'm not proud of, but I won't pretend I didn't feel. I noted which days Richard worked late, and which late nights came with a phone call he took in the garage with the door shut, a habit I'd always assumed was simply about not disturbing me, and had never once questioned. I noted that the Thursday post office box mail always went directly into his briefcase, never onto the kitchen counter with the rest of our mail. I noted, with a small cold feeling in my stomach, that he had started checking his phone at dinner more than he used to, angling the screen slightly away from me out of what looked, now that I was actually watching, like habit rather than accident. I found the key by accident, or perhaps not entirely by accident, while dusting his office bookshelf on a Sunday afternoon while he was out at the hardware store. A small hollowed section in the false spine of an old accounting textbook, the kind of hiding place you'd only find if you were actually running your hand along every book on the shelf, which I was, because by then I had stopped pretending to myself that I was simply cleaning. A small brass key. Old. Slightly tarnished, clearly not new. I put it back exactly where I found it and said nothing, and I waited. Richard traveled to the state capital on the third weekend of the following month, his regular conference, gone Friday afternoon through Sunday evening, a trip he'd made with such reliable regularity over the years that I could have set a calendar by it. I had never once questioned it. I had never once, in 15 years of these trips, asked to see a conference brochure or a hotel confirmation. Friday evening, alone in the house for the first time in longer than I could remember with a real purpose in mind, I went into his office, retrieved the small brass key from its hiding place, and knelt down in front of the desk his father had once owned. My hands, I noticed distantly, shaking exactly the way the title of this story suggests they did. The lock gave with a small, quiet click that seemed far too ordinary a sound for what it revealed. Inside was not old tax paperwork. There was a second checkbook, from a bank I didn't recognize, registered to an account I had never seen listed on any of our joint statements. There was a folder of property documents for a house in a county 40 minutes from ours, a house I had never once heard mentioned in 20 years of marriage, and beneath the folder, tied together with faded string, a small bundle of letters. I opened one. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a woman's hand, careful and looping. Richard, the boy's tuition is due again in September. I know you said you'd handle it before the fall term starts. When will you tell her? He's asking questions again about why he's never met your side. The letter was signed Carol. I sat on the floor of my husband's office with that letter in my hands, for what felt like a very long time, the house silent around me the way it had never quite felt silent before, and something in my chest went cold and still, in a way I don't fully have words for even now. Not a child, I told myself desperately, searching for some more innocent explanation. Some client's son Richard had taken a professional interest in, some godson, and then my hand found the photograph tucked into the back of the folder, and whatever explanation I'd been building for myself collapsed at once. Richard, younger, perhaps 15 years younger, standing in front of a house I'd never seen, holding an infant against his shoulder with the easy, practiced comfort of a man who had held that particular baby many times before. I did not confront him when he came home Sunday evening, tired and pleasant from his conference, asking if I'd had a quiet weekend, and I said yes, it had been quiet, which was true in every sense except the one that mattered. I want to explain why I didn't simply demand answers, because I know some of you listening would have. I had thought about it, sitting on that office floor with Carol's letter in my hand. But 20 years of watching Richard operate, in his business and in our marriage, had taught me one clear thing about my husband. He was a man who, given a moment to prepare an explanation, could make almost anything sound reasonable. I had watched him do it with clients for 2 decades, watched him calm frightened people out of panic, with nothing but his even, careful voice. If I confronted him with what I'd found before I understood the full shape of it, I was certain he would find some way to make even this sound survivable, containable, something I would once again simply absorb and move past the way I had absorbed every small unasked question for 20 years. I photographed everything in that drawer before I locked it again. The letters, the property documents, the unfamiliar bank statements tucked inside the folder, and I returned the key to its hiding place exactly as I'd found it, and then I did something I had never imagined myself capable of. I began, quietly and methodically, to build a case. I found Frank Delgado, the way I imagine most frightened women find people like him, through a late-night search on my laptop, at an hour when I should have been asleep beside my husband. Retired detective, 22 years with the state police, now doing quiet private investigative work from a small office above a bakery downtown. I called him from my car in the community college parking lot between classes, my heart pounding as though I were the one who'd done something wrong. Frank was a heavy-set man in his 60s with tired, careful eyes, the kind of person who had clearly heard every version of the story I was about to tell him and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. I brought him the photographs I'd taken, the copied bank account information, the property documents, and he listened without interrupting, occasionally writing something on a legal pad in handwriting I couldn't read upside down. It took him 11 days to bring me the full picture, and when he finally sat across from me at his small desk and laid it out, I understood that what I had found in that drawer was only the surface of something far deeper. Carol Whitfield had been part of Richard's life, in some capacity, since before our 10th wedding anniversary. Their son, now 19, had been born the same year I was pregnant with our daughter Elizabeth, a fact that landed in my chest like a physical blow when Frank said it aloud. For nearly 2 decades, Richard had been quietly supporting a second household 40 minutes from our home, paying tuition, covering a mortgage, maintaining an entire parallel life, funded, and this was the detail that changed everything, not from some separate income I knew nothing about, but from money diverted, in small, careful increments over the years, from our joint investment and retirement accounts, the very accounts Richard had always managed personally as our family's financial advisor, the accounts I had never once needed to look at closely because I trusted him completely to handle what he called, so reasonably, the boring parts of marriage. He's disguised the withdrawals as client escrow transfers and business reserve accounts, Frank told me, sliding a folder of documentation across the table. Technically it's fraud, Mrs. Coleman, even against his own firm's compliance standards, not just against you personally. But more immediately relevant to you, your actual retirement security, the number you probably believe you and your husband have built over 20 years, is significantly smaller than what's on the surface. He's been managing your entire financial life, and for 2 decades, you've never once had reason to check his work. I sat in my car outside Frank's office for nearly 40 minutes after that meeting, before I trusted myself to drive, absorbing the fact that the man I had built an entire quiet, sensible life alongside had been living 2 lives simultaneously with such practiced calm that I had never once, not for a single day in 20 years, suspected anything beyond what he showed me. I thought about my own instinct, sitting there, to go home and scream at him the moment he walked through the door. And then I thought about Patricia, Diane's cousin, 31 years married, and blindsided, with nothing in her name, and nowhere to stand. I thought about the fact that Richard controlled every account, every document, every legal thread of our shared life, and that if I confronted him without protecting myself first, I would be handing him exactly the advance warning a man like him would need to disappear whatever remained before I could ever prove what I'd found. I decided, sitting in that parking lot, that before Richard knew I understood anything, I would make absolutely certain he could no longer touch what was left. Frank Delgado recommended a lawyer named Elaine Rourke, a family law attorney in the next county, with a reputation, he said, for moving quickly and quietly, when quickness and quiet were exactly what a client needed. Elaine's office was small and unglamorous, the kind of place that clearly didn't waste money on appearances because it didn't need to. She was perhaps 60, sharp-eyed, entirely without the softness I think I'd unconsciously expected from a woman meant to help me. She listened to the whole account without a single interruption, reviewing Frank's documentation, the photographed letters, the bank records, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that helped me feel steady too. "Mrs. Coleman, I want to be direct with you, because I suspect you'd prefer that to gentle right now." "Please," I said. "Your husband has functioned, for the entirety of your marriage, as the sole manager of your joint financial life. That gave him enormous latitude, and he's used it. What you've found isn't simply an affair. It's 2 decades of undisclosed asset diversion. On its own, infidelity gives you grounds for divorce, but very little additional leverage in most states. Concealed marital fraud is a different matter entirely. It affects asset division, it affects how a court views his conduct, and depending on what my forensic accountant finds when she goes through the full account history, it may affect considerably more than that." "What do I need to do?" "Nothing dramatic yet," Elaine said. "The single most important thing right now is that he doesn't know you know. The moment he suspects you've found that drawer, everything in it will disappear, digitally and otherwise, faster than you can imagine. I'm going to file protective measures this week, freezing further transfers on your joint accounts under a legal notice, documenting everything we currently have on record, and quietly engaging a forensic accountant to trace exactly how deep this goes. You are going to go home, and you are going to continue exactly as you have been. Can you do that?" I thought of the 20 years I had spent quietly not asking questions, and something in me, some old, exhausted muscle, understood exactly how to keep doing what I had always done, except now, for the first time, on purpose. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." The following weeks were, I think, the strangest of my entire marriage. I made dinner. I asked Richard about his day. I sat across from him at our kitchen table and discussed the Hendersons' new fence and Elizabeth's upcoming visit and whether we should finally replace the water heater. And the entire time, quietly, methodically, Elaine's office was assembling a case against the life he'd built behind my back. Diane became my anchor during those weeks, the one person who knew the whole truth and could absorb the parts of my rage and grief I couldn't show at home. "You are allowed to feel exactly as furious as you feel," she told me one night on the phone, after I'd broken down for the first time since finding that drawer. "Just don't let him see it yet. Save it. Save every bit of it for the moment it will actually do you some good." It was on a Thursday evening, taking out the recycling, that I overheard Richard on the phone in the garage, his voice low, and something made me stop just outside the door instead of walking past. "Before the audit, Carol, I promise, I'm handling it," he was saying. "No, she won't find out. She's never once asked to see the account statements in 20 years. Why would she start now?" I stood very still in the dark driveway, my hand over my own phone, recording every word, the way I imagined some quiet, patient part of me had been waiting my whole marriage for exactly this kind of proof, though I'd never have called it that until I actually needed it. I called Elaine the next morning and told her what I'd captured. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's exactly what we needed, Mrs. Coleman. I think it's time to set the date." I went home that evening and told Richard, in the same easy tone I'd used to discuss the water heater, that I'd been thinking we should finally redo his office this coming weekend. New shelving, maybe finally clear out some of the old files in that bottom drawer while we were at it. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been unease, and then smooth itself over into the calm, reasonable expression he wore for the entire world. "Sure, Margaret," he said. "Whatever you think is best." Saturday evening, I asked Richard to sit with me at the dining room table before we started on the office, telling him I wanted to talk through what we should keep and what we should finally let go of. He came willingly, still entirely unaware, carrying the particular ease of a man who believed, after 20 years, that he understood exactly who his wife was and precisely how much she was willing to look at. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, the way Elaine had promised it would. Richard's head came up sharply. "We're not expecting anyone." "I am," I said, and I rose to answer it myself. Elaine Rourke stood on the porch in a gray suit, calm and entirely without drama, a leather folder tucked under one arm. Beside her stood a forensic accountant named Susan Marsh, whom I'd met only once before, holding a laptop case with the same unhurried confidence Elaine carried. "Good evening, Mr. Coleman," Elaine said, stepping past me into the house before Richard had fully risen from his chair. "I think it's time we talked." I watched every stage of what happened next play across my husband's face in the following 10 minutes. Confusion, then the first cold understanding, then something that might have been fear for the first time in our entire marriage. Elaine laid it out with the same steady precision she'd used in her office weeks earlier. The second household. Carol Whitfield. The 19-year-old son whose existence had never once been disclosed to me. The 2 decades of diverted funds, disguised in our joint accounts as business reserves and client escrow. Funds that were, in fact, mine as much as his. Susan opened her laptop and walked through the numbers with clinical calm, the true, full shape of what our retirement accounts actually contained, after 20 years of quiet siphoning, a number substantially smaller than the one Richard had shown me every year at our annual financial check-in, a ritual I now understood had been performance rather than partnership. And then Elaine reached into her folder and set down, one by one, the pieces of evidence I had gathered so quietly over the past several weeks. Copies of Carol's letters, the photograph of Richard holding his son, and finally, her own phone, from which she played the recording I had captured in the driveway, Richard's voice filling our dining room, low and certain. "She's never once asked to see the account statements in 20 years, why would she start now?" Richard's face had gone the same gray it had turned the night he found me at that drawer, except now there was nowhere left for him to close and lock anything away. "Margaret," he said, and his voice had lost every ounce of its usual careful control. I never meant for it to go on this long. I was going to tell you. I was always going to tell you, when the time was right." "How long have you been planning to tell me?" I asked. 19 years? 20? He had no answer for that, and I found, sitting across from him at the table where we had shared 10,000 ordinary dinners, that I didn't need one anymore. "You didn't lock that drawer to protect me," I told him, and I felt my voice come out steadier than I believed possible. "You locked it to protect yourself. 20 years, Richard. I gave you 20 years of not asking questions because I trusted you completely, and you used every single one of those years to build a life I wasn't allowed to know existed. I'm done keeping your secrets safe for you." He left that night, packing what he needed into a single suitcase, while Elaine and Susan quietly finished documenting what they'd need for the proceedings ahead, and Richard didn't argue, didn't plead the way he had over that drawer weeks earlier, because there was, finally, nothing left to plead for. He paused at the door before he stepped out into the dark, and for one moment I thought he might say something that would explain all of it, some final accounting that would make sense of 20 years, but he only looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully name, and then he was gone. I want to tell you the months since then have been simple, but grief doesn't work that way. even grief for something you're glad to be free of. There have been nights I've sat in that house alone and cried for the marriage I believed I had, not the one that actually existed. There have been mornings I've woken up and, for just a moment before memory catches up, reached for a version of my life that no longer exists. But there have also been mornings like this one, sitting on my back porch with coffee going lukewarm in my hands, watching the light move slowly across the garden Richard and I once planted together. A garden I've decided to keep because it was always more mine than his anyway. Elaine secured a settlement that protected far more of our shared assets than I believe I'd have managed alone, and Frank's careful documentation meant Richard's firm eventually launched its own internal review into the diverted funds, a matter now entirely out of my hands, and frankly, none of my concern anymore. I kept the house. I emptied his old office of every trace of him, and slowly, over several weekends, turned it into something entirely my own. A reading room, sunlight coming through the same window that used to fall across that locked desk. I did keep the desk itself, in the end. I had it refinished, the brass lock removed entirely, and now it sits by the window where I do my grading and write my letters. No longer a place for hiding anything, simply a good, solid piece of furniture that belonged, once, to better intentions than the ones it came to hold. I think often about the difference between privacy and secrecy, a distinction I don't believe I properly understood until this year of my life. Privacy is something two people build together, a respect for the parts of each other that don't need constant explanation. Secrecy is something one person builds alone, at the other's expense, and calls it protection when really, it was only ever self-preservation. I think about what it means to spend 20 years being what I thought was a good wife, only to discover that being a good wife, in Richard's understanding of our marriage, mostly meant being someone who didn't ask too many questions. I don't intend to make that mistake again, in this marriage or any other I might someday choose to build. If you were in my position, I wonder what you would have done differently, or the same. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Let's keep walking this road together.